Picture a chateau rising from the Blue Ridge Mountains, its limestone towers piercing the Carolina sky like something torn from the Loire Valley and planted in the wilderness, a palace of 250 rooms where America's Gilded Age reached its most extravagant, most impossibly decadent expression. And ask yourself this: what kind of man builds such a monument to himself in the mountains of the American South? And what dark arithmetic of wealth and power makes such a vision possible? The answer begins not in these mountains but in the railroad yards and steamship docks where the Vanderbilt fortune was born, in the brutal calculus of monopoly and the broken bodies of workers whose names history forgot, in the smoke-filled rooms where Cornelius, the Commodore, Vanderbilt crushed competitors and carved an empire from steel and steam and human labor, amassing a fortune that would make him America's richest man, a colossus whose wealth exceeded the federal treasury itself, whose grandson George Washington Vanderbilt would inherit not just money but the burden of that money, the terrible question of what one does with wealth so vast it seems to bend gravity around itself. The Commodore built his empire through ruthlessness that even his contemporaries found shocking, through rate wars that bankrupted competitors, through monopolies that strangled entire industries, through a willingness to exploit workers so thoroughly that when the Great Railroad Strike of 1877 erupted across America, when workers pushed beyond endurance finally pushed back, federal troops had to kill dozens to protect the profits that would flow into Vanderbilt coffers, blood. Money that would eventually purchase French tapestries and Renaissance paintings and 4 acres of floor space in the North Carolina mountains. This is the foundation upon which Biltmore rises, and we must never forget it, must never let the beauty of Hunt's architecture or Olmsted's landscapes obscure the fundamental fact that every dollar spent on this palace was extracted from someone's labor, someone's life, someone's dreams deferred or destroyed so that one family could live like European royalty in a nation supposedly founded on equality. The Commodore was born in 1794 on Staten Island, started with a single ferry boat, and died in 1877 worth over $100 million, more than 1 out of every $20 in circulation in the entire United States, a concentration of wealth so extreme it defied comprehension then and still defies it now. He achieved this through strategies that his biographers sometimes call visionary and sometimes call predatory depending on their politics. He undercut competitors until they went bankrupt, then bought their assets for pennies on the dollar. He bribed legislators to get favorable laws and judges to get favorable rulings. He watered stock and manipulated markets and crushed anyone who stood between him and profit. He paid workers as little as possible and fired them the moment they weren't needed. He created monopolies in steamship and railroad transportation that allowed him to charge whatever he wanted because customers had no alternative, and when workers organized for better conditions he broke their unions with hired thugs and willing government force, the state always ready to defend capital against labor, to protect property against people, to ensure that the machinery of extraction could grind on undisturbed by the complaints of those being ground. George was the youngest of 8 children born to William Henry Vanderbilt, who had doubled the Commodore's already staggering fortune through careful management and continued monopoly, and Maria Louisa Kissam, born in November 1862 into a world of unimaginable privilege, a world where servants outnumbered family members, where every whim was indulged, where the normal constraints of budget and possibility simply didn't exist, where wanting something and having it were separated only by the time required to purchase it. He was a sickly child, prone to respiratory illnesses, kept inside when other boys played outside, tutored privately rather than sent to school, developing the interiority and bookishness that would define his character, growing into a peculiar kind of aristocrat, intellectual and refined where his brothers were aggressive and business-minded, a collector of books and art who traveled Europe with the hunger of someone trying to fill an emptiness that inheritance alone could never satisfy. Accumulating first editions and tapestries and paintings with an obsession that bordered on desperation, as if beauty purchased could somehow legitimize wealth extracted, as if surrounding himself with culture could transform him from heir into patron, from passive recipient of blood money into active creator of something worthwhile. His father died in December 1885, dividing an estate of approximately $200 million among his 8 children, making each of them multimillionaires many times over, and George received his share, $5 million outright, plus the income from a $5 million trust fund that would generate approximately $250,000 annually. More money than he could possibly spend on any normal definition of spending, enough to live like royalty. Forever without ever touching the principal, the magic of inherited wealth that compounds across generations, that turns one man's exploitation into another man's ease, that allows descendants to live lives of pure consumption subsidized by ancestors' extraction. George was 23 years old, had never worked a day in his life, would never need to work, and this freedom that wealth purchased was both liberation and curse, liberty and burden, because what does one do with unlimited resources and no necessity? What purpose does life serve when survival is guaranteed and status is inherited and achievement is optional? This is the existential crisis of the rentier class, the problem that builds palaces, the void that wealth tries to fill with ever more extravagant gestures, and George would spend his life trying to prove that his existence meant something beyond the accident of his birth, that he deserved his fortune in some way that birth alone could not justify, that he could be more than just another idle heir living off grandfather's brutality. He traveled constantly through the 1880s, to Europe especially, spending months in Paris and London, visiting museums and galleries and auction houses, buying books and art with the systematic thoroughness he brought to everything, trying to educate himself into the aristocracy that birth had given him money but not membership, because American millionaires were still seen as crude by European standards, as lacking the centuries of refinement that supposedly distinguished old money from new, culture from cash, taste from mere purchasing power. George bought more than 22,000 books over his lifetime, amassing one of the finest private libraries in America, including first editions and rare manuscripts, medieval texts and modern novels, works in 8 languages that he could read with varying degrees of fluency, building a collection that demonstrated not just wealth but scholarship, not just resources but intellectual curiosity, trying to become the kind of person who deserved to own such books rather than merely the kind who could afford them. He commissioned John Singer Sargent to paint his portrait in 1890, paying top dollar to be immortalized by the most fashionable portraitist of the age, and Sargent captured something essential about George, the sensitivity, the refinement, the slight physical frailty, but also the confidence that unlimited wealth provides, the assumption of worthiness that money inculcates, the sense that the world exists to serve rather than be served, that his desires matter more than others' needs, because he can pay for them to matter. He purchased works by Renoir and Whistler, bought tapestries that had hung in European castles for centuries, acquired furniture and decorative objects with the voracity of someone filling a hole that can never be filled, spending his inheritance as fast as his trust funds generated it, and still the money kept growing, kept compounding, the magical mathematics of capital that ensures the rich get richer simply by being rich, by having resources that generate returns that can be reinvested to generate more returns in an endless upward spiral that concentrates wealth in fewer and fewer hands across generations until you get the kind of inequality that produces both Biltmore estates and Appalachian poverty within 20 miles of each other, both Vanderbilt millions and workers earning 75 cents per day, both art collections worth fortunes and children who never learn to read because they must work instead of attending school. George first visited Asheville, North Carolina, in 1888, drawn by the mountain air supposedly therapeutic for his chronic respiratory problems, his fragile constitution requiring the kind of extended rest cure that only those with unlimited time and money could afford, and something in those ancient peaks spoke to him, whispered possibilities of a private kingdom where he could build not just a house but a world, where he could prove that his inheritance meant something more than accumulated exploitation, that he could be patron and steward rather than merely another gilded parasite living off grandfather's brutality. The mountains were beautiful in a way that New York society could never be, wild and ancient and seemingly untouched by the industrial capitalism that had created his fortune, though of course they were not untouched, had never been untouched, had been home to Cherokee people before forced removal on the Trail of Tears, had been worked by subsistence farmers for generations, had been scarred by the Civil War that had raged through these regions, had been transformed by Reconstruction and its failures into a landscape of poverty where freed slaves and poor whites scratched livings from exhausted soil, where communities struggled to survive in an economy that had been devastated by war and never rebuilt, where George saw not human suffering but opportunity, not communities to support but land to acquire, not people to help but obstacles to remove from the canvas upon which he would paint his vision. He began purchasing land in 1888 with the patience of someone who need never worry about money running out, acre after acre, parcel after parcel, deploying agents to negotiate with landowners who often had little choice but to sell, Who faced tax burdens they couldn't pay and failed crops they couldn't overcome and the grinding poverty of the post-war South that made any cash offer tempting regardless of the long-term consequences, who were told that Georgia's prices were generous even as they watched their ancestral lands disappear into someone else's vision of paradise, even as their communities were broken apart and their connections to place severed so that a millionaire from New York could have more privacy, more scenery, more space to build his dream. The archives are carefully vague about these transactions, speaking in the passive voice of inevitability, describing willing sellers and fair prices without examining the power dynamics that made those sales possible, without asking what choice really means when one party has unlimited resources and the other faces starvation, when one party can afford to wait and the other cannot, when one party is building a pleasure palace and the other is trying to survive another winter. The estate's own materials now acknowledge that much of the land was in very poor condition, and many of the farmers and other landowners were glad to sell, which frames displacement as liberation, poverty as opportunity, the loss of ancestral land as fortunate timing, the kind of historical interpretation that wealth always prefers, that makes acquisition look like mutual benefit. That erases coercion by focusing on compensation, that treats the entire transaction as if power didn't exist, as if the playing field were level, as if negotiating with a Vanderbilt and negotiating with your neighbor were somehow equivalent acts occurring in equivalent contexts with equivalent consequences. George eventually controlled 125,000 acres of mountain forest, an area larger than Manhattan, Brooklyn, and Queens combined, land that had been worked to exhaustion by subsistence farmers who lacked the resources to maintain it properly, who had to extract every possible bit of productivity just to survive, who couldn't afford to let fields lie fallow or practice crop rotation or implement soil conservation because survival required harvesting everything the land could give right now, this year, this season, because next year was not guaranteed and long-term thinking is a luxury of those who control their long-term. Entire communities were displaced to make room for George's estate, including the Shiloh settlement, African-American landowners whose property stood in the way of George's vision and who found themselves relocated, compensated perhaps but certainly removed, their place in the landscape erased so that George could have his pastoral fantasy, his managed wilderness, his private kingdom where poverty and struggle would be invisible, would exist only as abstracted labor rather than actual human beings with names and histories and claims to the land that predated his checkbook by generations. The displacement of Shiloh and other communities is a story the estate has only begun to tell in recent years, mounting exhibitions and producing materials that acknowledge what was lost when Biltmore was gained, who paid the price for George's paradise, whose homes and churches and graveyards disappeared beneath Olmsted's landscaping, whose connections to place and community and history were severed so that one man could own more land than he could ever use, could gaze upon vistas cleared of human presence, could enjoy nature purified of the complications that actual people represent. This displacement, this erasure of communities to make room for one man's estate, is a story repeated across America's Gilded Age, from the Adirondacks where the wealthy built their great camps to California where railroad barons created private parks, wherever great wealth decided it wanted scenery without people, beauty without complexity, nature without the messy reality of those who actually lived in it, worked it, loved it, belonged to it in ways that ownership could never capture. Because ownership is a legal fiction while belonging is an embodied reality, a relationship to place that develops across generations and cannot be purchased no matter how many dollars you have. He hired Richard Morris Hunt in 1888, the most prestigious architect in America, perhaps the only architect in America with the training and vision to attempt what George wanted, a man who had trained at the École des Beaux-Arts in Paris, the first American to do so, who had designed mansions for the Astors and Vanderbilts in New York, who had created the pedestal for the Statue of Liberty, whose specialty was making American money look like European aristocracy, the alchemy of turning railroad fortunes into Renaissance palaces, transforming exploitation into elegance through the magic of architecture, proving that Americans could match Europeans in taste if not in bloodlines, in refinement if not in titles, in the physical manifestations of culture even if the actual culture remained questionable. Hunt understood intuitively what George wanted even if George couldn't quite articulate it himself, not just a house but a statement, not just shelter but a claim to cultural legitimacy, a declaration that American wealth had finally achieved the refinement of European nobility, that the Vanderbilts were not merely rich but civilized, not just powerful but cultured, worthy of their fortune in a way that the Commodore, for all his millions, had never been, deserving of respect not just for what they owned but for what they appreciated, for their taste and patronage and cultivation, for being the kind of people who could recognize beauty and had the resources to surround themselves with it, who could live among art and architecture that testified to their superiority, their difference, their right to rule even in a democracy that officially rejected such hierarchies. Hunt designed a chateau in the style of the French Renaissance, inspired specifically by the chateaux of Blois and Chenonceau in the Loire Valley, buildings constructed in the 16th century for French royalty and nobility, and the choice was deliberate, calculated to evoke not just wealth but lineage, not just resources but heritage, to suggest that the Vanderbilts belonged to a tradition of noble patronage rather than a recent history of industrial exploitation, that there was continuity between Francis I building hunting lodges in the 1500s and George Vanderbilt building Biltmore in the 1890s, that somehow the contexts were equivalent, the moralities comparable, that being rich in a democracy was basically the same as being royal in a monarchy, that inherited wealth justified itself simply through its existence and its good taste. The design featured steeply pitched roofs and towers and turrets, gargoyles leering from the limestone facade like medieval demons guarding modern excess, dormers and chimneys and intricate stonework, every architectural detail calculated to evoke centuries of European history, to suggest age and permanence and legitimacy, to make brand new construction look ancient and established, to give instant history to wealth that had none, to purchase in stone and mortar the lineage that birth had failed to provide, the coat of arms that democracy supposedly prohibited, the visible markers of superiority that American ideology claimed didn't exist but that American practice always honored. The house would contain 4 acres of floor space, approximately 175,000 square feet, 250 rooms including 35 bedrooms and 43 bathrooms, with an indoor swimming pool 70 feet long tiled in Art Nouveau patterns, with a bowling alley and gymnasium for recreation because the wealthy needed spaces for leisure that the working classes could scarcely imagine, with a banquet hall whose ceiling soared 70 feet high and whose triple fireplace could burn entire trees, logs so large they had to be delivered by wagon and hoisted by machinery, fires so immense they could heat a space large enough to hold hundreds, with a library designed to hold George's growing collection of 22,000 volumes, 2 stories high with a painted ceiling and carved walnut shelves and a secret staircase hidden behind false books, first editions and rare manuscripts that he accumulated with the same obsessive energy he brought to everything, trying to read himself into the aristocracy that birth had given him money but not membership, trying to become through learning what he could not be through heredity, trying to justify his existence through cultivation, through being able to discuss literature and history and art with the kind of casual erudition that only unlimited time for study makes possible, that only freedom from the necessity of earning a living permits, that only wealth enables because poverty demands that every hour be devoted to survival rather than improvement, to making money rather than making meaning. The house would feature technological marvels that most of America could not imagine much less afford, innovations that demonstrated how wealth accelerates into the future while poverty remains trapped in the past, electric lights powered by the estate's own generators, one of the first private electrical systems in America, making Biltmore a glowing beacon in the darkness while the surrounding countryside relied on candles and kerosene, the technological divide mirroring and reinforcing the economic divide, showing in the most literal way how some people lived in illuminated modernity while others remained in dark tradition. Central heating fed by massive boilers in the basement, a coal-fired system that could warm every room in winter through steam radiators, technology that meant the Vanderbilts never had to wake to cold rooms or huddle near fireplaces, that meant servants didn't have to carry wood and light fires in every bedroom each morning, though of course servants still had to do many things each morning, still had to labor to create the comfort that technology supposedly made effortless, because technology under capitalism doesn't eliminate labor so much as redistribute it, doesn't free humans so much as stratify them, doesn't create leisure for all so much as concentrate it for a few while intensifying work for others. Refrigeration for preserving food, mechanical systems for keeping ice year-round, meaning fresh food and cold drinks even in Carolina summers, luxuries that transformed daily life in ways both large and small, that changed what could be eaten and when, That expanded the realm of the possible for those who could afford the machinery while leaving everyone else subject to the same seasonal limitations that had governed human life since the beginning of agriculture. Elevators to carry guests between floors, mechanical lifts powered by electricity, sparing the wealthy the indignity of stairs while requiring someone to operate the machinery, someone to maintain it, someone to stand in the small cage and pull the levers and say, "Yes sir," and "Yes ma'am," and ask what floor and wait for orders, transforming vertical mobility into another opportunity for class performance. Another chance to be served, another reminder that some people ride while others run the machinery. Speaking tubes and call buttons to summon servants, technology designed explicitly to make human beings more responsive to the needs of the wealthy, to allow the touch of a button to bring a person running, to transform human will into mechanical efficiency, to ensure that service could be requested without the bother of personal interaction, without having to seek out staff or raise one's voice or even stand up from one's chair, reducing human relationship to signal and response, to command and obedience, to the kind of frictionless service that looks like magic only because the labor has been rendered invisible through architectural design and social hierarchy and the servant's own training in self-erasure. Indoor plumbing with hot and cold running water, bathrooms attached to bedrooms, 43 bathrooms in an era when most Americans used outhouses and bathed weekly if that, when running water was luxury and hot running water was fantasy, when the technology existed but the infrastructure didn't, when what was possible for the Vanderbilts was impossible for everyone else not because of innovation but because of cost, not because of invention but because of inequality, not because the knowledge didn't exist to bring such comforts to everyone but because the will and the economic distribution didn't exist, because capitalism allocates resources based on purchasing power rather than human need, because some people get 43 bathrooms while others get none. And both extremes exist not as accidents or natural phenomena but as outcomes of the same economic system that creates both poverty and extreme wealth, both deprivation and excess, both outhouses and indoor pools. Hunt worked on the Biltmore design from 1888 through 1895, spending 7 years refining and perfecting, making changes as George traveled and saw new things he wanted to incorporate, adding details and adjusting plans, and the correspondence between them reveals the seriousness with which both men approached the project, the sense that they were creating not just a house but a masterpiece, not just a residence but a monument that would outlast them, that would testify to their vision and taste and ambition long after they were gone, that would speak to future generations about what was possible when genius and resources combined, when an architect of Hunt's caliber had access to a client with George's wealth and willingness to spend it, when constraints of budget and practicality were removed and the only question was what should be built rather than what could be afforded. Hunt died in July 1895, just months before the house opened, never quite seeing the completed realization of his greatest work, and there's something poignant about that, something that suggests the futility of all such projects, the way that even our grandest achievements outlive us, the way that we pour our lives into things that will stand when we have fallen, that our monuments are always partly tombs, tributes not just to vision but to mortality, testaments not just to what we built but to the fact that we are gone and the building remains, temporary creatures creating permanent structures, ephemeral beings leaving indelible marks, humans trying to defeat death through architecture, through leaving something behind that says we were here, we mattered, we made this, remember us. He hired Frederick Law Olmsted in 1888, the landscape architect who had designed Central Park in New York and dozens of other major projects, who had created the grounds for the World's Columbian Exposition in Chicago, who was recognized internationally as the master of his craft, the man who had essentially invented landscape architecture as a profession, who understood that landscapes could be designed like buildings, that nature could be shaped to serve human purposes while appearing completely natural, that the art of the landscape designer was to conceal art, to make design look like happy accident, to create beauty that seemed to have always existed rather than having been deliberately constructed at enormous expense. Olmsted was in his 60s when he took the Biltmore Commission, nearing the end of a legendary career, though he would continue working into his 70s before dementia forced his retirement, and he brought to the project all his accumulated wisdom about how landscapes shape human experience, how designed environments can create specific moods and effects, how nature can be manipulated to appear untouched while actually serving carefully calculated purposes, how trees and shrubs and water And stone can be arranged to guide the eye and move the spirit and create experiences that seem spontaneous but are actually the result of meticulous planning and enormous labor. He understood immediately that the land George had purchased was in terrible condition, exhausted by generations of farming without adequate soil conservation, eroded and depleted and scarred by the kind of extractive agriculture that poverty demands, that short-term thinking necessitates, that occurs when people must take everything the land can give right now because there might not be a later, when survival requires extraction rather than stewardship, when the choice is between preserving the land for the future and feeding your family today, and there is no choice, there is only necessity, and the land pays the price of human poverty, becomes itself impoverished, its fertility stolen by the desperation of those who depended on it. Olmsted proposed not just gardens around the house but a comprehensive restoration of the entire estate, converting worn-out farmland back to forest through scientific management, reforesting denuded slopes to prevent erosion, creating a managed landscape that would demonstrate what was possible when resources and knowledge combined, when wealth could be applied to restoration rather than just extraction, when long-term thinking could replace short-term desperation because someone finally had the luxury of thinking long-term, of planning for decades and centuries rather than seasons, of treating land as something to nurture rather than something to mine. This forestry program would become one of Biltmore's most significant legacies, genuinely important in the history of American conservation, pioneering techniques and approaches that would influence national policy, demonstrating that forests could be managed sustainably, that harvesting and preservation weren't contradictory but complementary when done properly, when science guided practice and resources supported implementation, when the goal was stewardship rather than just extraction, perpetuity rather than just profit, though even here we must acknowledge the complexity. The land needed restoration because it had been overworked by farmers who lacked resources to maintain it properly, farmers who were often former slaves or poor whites trying to survive in an extractive economy, and while George's restoration was genuine and beneficial, while Olmsted's work represented real progress in ecological thinking, it also served to erase the history of those farmers, to replace human struggle with managed nature, to transform a landscape of poverty into a landscape of leisure, to cleanse the land of the marks of those who had worked it, to make it look as if it had never been touched by desperate hands, to create the illusion of wilderness in a place that had been intensely human, intensely marked by labor and life and loss. George hired Gifford Pinchot in 1892 to manage the forestry operations, the first professional forester in America. The young man recently returned from studying in Europe where forestry was already an established science, where forests had been managed systematically for generations, where the Americans were seen as barbarians wastefully destroying their natural resources, and Pinchot brought European methods to American conditions, adapting techniques to local ecology, training workers in selective harvesting and replanting, establishing timber operations that could generate revenue while preserving forest health, demonstrating that forestry could be economically viable, that sustainability didn't mean preservation without use but rather use without depletion, that forests could produce timber indefinitely if managed properly, if harvesting matched growth, if short-term profits didn't override long-term planning. Pinchot left in 1895 to pursue his career in government service, eventually becoming the first head of the U.S. Forest Service, and George hired Dr. Karl Alwin Schenk to replace him, a German forester with a doctorate who would prove even more influential, who would establish the Biltmore Forest School in 1898, America's first forestry school, training hundreds of students in scientific forest management, creating the first generation of American professional foresters, men who would go on to manage both private and public forests, who would shape American forestry policy and practice for decades, who learned at Biltmore the principles they would apply nationally, and this educational legacy is perhaps George's greatest contribution, his most lasting impact beyond the house itself, the way his private wealth created public benefit through education, through training people who would serve purposes larger than George's own interests, though of course. We might also note that training foresters serves George's interests too, that having skilled managers increases the value of forest holdings, that what looks like pure generosity often serves strategic purposes, that even altruism under capitalism tends to align with self-interest, that the wealthy become philanthropists partly because philanthropy benefits them, partly because it legitimizes their wealth, partly because it allows them to shape society according to their vision, to determine what gets funded and what doesn't, what knowledge gets produced and what doesn't, who gets educated and who doesn't, a form of power that outlasts and possibly exceeds the direct power of wealth itself. Construction began in 1889 and would require 6 years to complete, 6 years of round-the-clock labor, 6 years during which approximately 1,000 workers and 60 stonemasons and dozens of other specialized craftsmen transformed vision into stone and mortar, timber and glass, transforming drawings into the largest private residence in America, transforming wealth into weight, into physical presence, into something that would stand for centuries, testifying to one man's vision and 10,000 men's labor. Because every great building is a collective achievement regardless of whose name it bears, because architecture is always collaboration between those who design and those who build, between vision and execution, between the architect who imagines and the workers who realize, between the client who pays and the laborers who produce, and while history tends to remember the names at the top, tends to credit individuals rather than collectives, tends to treat buildings as expressions of singular genius. The truth is that Biltmore was built by an army, by a workforce that at peak numbered over 1,000, by men whose names we mostly don't know, whose stories were never recorded, whose contribution has been erased by the very success of their work, which looks so perfect, so intentional, so inevitable that the labor becomes invisible, that the sweat and skill and sometimes blood that went into every stone seems to disappear, seems never to have existed, seems unnecessary to mention because surely such beauty simply appeared, surely such grandeur simply manifested without effort, surely the Vanderbilts simply willed it into existence through the magic of money rather than through the brutally physical work of human hands and backs and muscles. The workers came from everywhere, drawn by the promise of wages in a region still economically devastated by the Civil War, where unemployment was chronic and opportunities were scarce and any job was better than no job even if the conditions were hard and the pay was low and the work was dangerous. Local men from Asheville and surrounding counties, farmers between seasons, freedmen looking for cash wages, white workers displaced by economic transformation, skilled craftsmen imported from cities including New York and Philadelphia and Boston, men with specialized knowledge willing to travel for the right price, Italian stonemasons who understood the art of carved limestone and who traveled to North Carolina specifically for this project, bringing techniques and traditions that stretched back to the Renaissance, that connected Biltmore to centuries of European craftsmanship, that made the new house look old, that gave American wealth European pedigree, engineers and electricians and plumbers bringing modernity to the mountains, installing systems that didn't exist locally, that required expertise that had to be imported because the knowledge didn't exist here, because technology concentrates in wealthy areas and diffuses slowly to poor ones, because some places get electric lights and central heating while others wait decades for such innovations, not because of geography or accident but because of economics, because resources follow wealth rather than need, because capitalism builds where profit calls rather than where humans require. Carpenters and plasterers and painters and glaziers, an army of specialized labor coordinated by Superintendent Richard Sharp Smith, who managed this vast construction project with military precision, who kept track of materials and schedules and workers, who solved the endless problems that construction presents, who translated Hunt's drawings into physical reality, who made decisions about details that Hunt never specified, who improvised and adapted and kept the whole massive project moving forward despite delays and challenges and the sheer complexity of building something this large, this remote, of creating in the mountains what could barely be built in the city, of bringing materials and expertise to a place that had neither, of constructing modernity in a landscape still marked by tradition, still shaped by older ways of living and building, still operating according to rhythms that the Industrial Revolution had not yet fully transformed. The labor was brutal in ways that even contemporary observers sometimes acknowledged, though mostly the brutality was accepted as normal, as the natural condition of working men, as the price that labor paid for the privilege of employment, 10 hours a day, 6 days a week, for wages that were considered generous by the standards of 1890s North Carolina but were still measured in dollars per day rather than dignity per hour, still calculated to extract maximum work for minimum cost. Still predicated on the assumption that workers existed to serve capital rather than the other way around, that their purpose was to produce value for George rather than for themselves, that their labor enriched him rather than them, that they would go home exhausted to small houses or boarding rooms while the thing they were building would provide luxury for people who would never know their names, never acknowledge their contribution, never recognize that every comfortable moment in that house was purchased with someone else's sweat, someone else's exhaustion, someone else's years of life spent building someone else's dream. Though of course we might also note that training foresters serves George's interests too, that having skilled managers increases the value of forest holdings, that what looks like pure generosity often serves strategic purposes, that even altruism under capitalism tends to align with self-interest, that the wealthy become philanthropists partly because philanthropy benefits them, partly because it legitimizes their wealth, partly because it allows them to shape society according to their vision, to determine what gets funded and what doesn't, what knowledge gets produced and what doesn't, who gets educated and who doesn't, a form of power that outlasts and possibly exceeds the direct power of wealth itself. Construction began in 1889 and would require 6 years to complete, 6 years of round-the-clock labor, 6 years during which approximately 1,000 workers and 60 stonemasons and dozens of other specialized craftsmen transformed vision into stone and mortar, timber and glass, transforming drawings into the largest private residence in America, transforming wealth into weight, into physical presence, into something that would stand for centuries, testifying to one man's vision and 10,000 men's labor, because every great building is a collective achievement regardless of whose name it bears, because architecture is always collaboration between those who design and those who build, between vision and execution, between the architect who imagines and the workers who realize, between the client who pays and the laborers who produce, and while history tends to remember the names at the top, tends to credit individuals rather than collectives, tends to treat buildings as expressions of singular genius, the truth is that Biltmore was built by an army, by a workforce that at peak numbered over 1,000, by men whose names we mostly don't know, whose stories were never recorded, whose contribution has been erased by the very success of their work, which looks so perfect, so intentional, so inevitable that the labor becomes invisible, that the sweat and skill and sometimes blood that went into every stone seems to disappear, seems never to have existed, seems unnecessary to mention because surely such beauty simply appeared, surely such grandeur simply manifested without effort, surely the Vanderbilts simply willed it into existence through the magic of money rather than through the brutally physical work of human hands and backs and muscles. The workers came from everywhere, drawn by the promise of wages in a region still economically devastated by the Civil War, where unemployment was chronic and opportunities were scarce and any job was better than no job even if the conditions were hard and the pay was low and the work was dangerous. Local men from Asheville and surrounding counties, farmers between seasons, freedmen looking for cash wages, white workers displaced by economic transformation, skilled craftsmen imported from cities including New York and Philadelphia and Boston, men with specialized knowledge willing to travel for the right price, Italian stonemasons who understood the art of carved limestone and who traveled to North Carolina specifically for this project, bringing techniques and traditions that stretched back to the Renaissance, that connected Biltmore to centuries of European craftsmanship, that made the new house look old, that gave American wealth European pedigree, engineers and electricians and plumbers bringing modernity to the mountains, installing systems that didn't exist locally, that required expertise that had to be imported because the knowledge didn't exist here, because technology concentrates in wealthy areas and diffuses slowly to poor ones, because some places get electric lights and central heating while others wait decades for such innovations, not because of geography or accident but because of economics, because resources follow wealth rather than need, because capitalism builds where profit calls rather than where humans require. Carpenters and plasterers and painters and glaziers, an army of specialized labor coordinated by Superintendent Richard Sharp Smith, who managed this vast construction project with military precision, who kept track of materials and schedules and workers, who solved the endless problems that construction presents, who translated Hunt's drawings into physical reality, who made decisions about details that Hunt never specified, who improvised and adapted and kept the whole massive project moving forward despite delays and challenges and the sheer complexity of building something this large, this remote, of creating in the mountains what could barely be built in the city, of bringing materials and expertise to a place that had neither, of constructing modernity in a landscape still marked by tradition, still shaped by older ways of living and building, still operating according to rhythms that the Industrial Revolution had not yet fully transformed. The labor was brutal in ways that even contemporary observers sometimes acknowledged, though mostly the brutality was accepted as normal, as the natural condition of working men, as the price that labor paid for the privilege of employment, 10 hours a day, 6 days a week, for wages that were considered generous by the standards of 1890s North Carolina but were still measured in dollars per day rather than dignity per hour, still calculated to extract maximum work for minimum cost. Still predicated on the assumption that workers existed to serve capital rather than the other way around, that their purpose was to produce value for George rather than for themselves, that their labor enriched him rather than them, that they would go home exhausted to small houses or boarding rooms while the thing they were building would provide luxury for people who would never know their names, never acknowledge their contribution, never recognize that every comfortable moment in that house was purchased with someone else's sweat, someone else's exhaustion, someone else's years of life spent building someone else's dream. The stonemasons were paid more than common laborers, recognition of their specialized skills, but even they were making perhaps $3 or $4 per day while George was earning, without lifting a finger, the interest on his trust fund that amounted to nearly $700 per day, every single day, including Sundays when the workers rested and Saturdays when they worked half-days and holidays when construction halted. The money flowing into George's accounts whether he was awake or asleep, working or playing, in America or Europe, the magical perpetual motion machine of capital that generates returns simply for existing, that rewards ownership rather than effort, that makes being rich the most lucrative job in the world while making actual jobs the domain of those unfortunate enough not to be rich. The limestone came from Indiana, transported by rail to Asheville, thousands of tons of carefully cut blocks that had been quarried from the earth by men working in conditions that made Biltmore construction look comfortable, men who breathed stone dust that would eventually kill them with silicosis, who worked with explosives and heavy equipment in constant danger, who were paid even less than the Biltmore workers because quarrying was considered unskilled labor despite requiring tremendous physical strength and courage, men whose contribution to Biltmore was even more remote and invisible than the construction workers, whose names no one recorded and whose sacrifice no one acknowledged and whose deaths from occupational disease were considered normal, acceptable, the cost of doing business, the price of progress, as if progress required human sacrifice, as if beauty necessitated suffering, as if George's chateau could only rise through the breaking of bodies in Indiana quarries and North Carolina construction sites, through the systematic extraction of human life and health and years that would never be recovered, never be compensated, never be acknowledged as the true cost of what was being built. The bricks came from local clay, millions of them manufactured on site in kilns that burned constantly, that filled the air with smoke and heat, that were tended by workers who labored in temperatures that would be considered torture in any other context but were simply working conditions in the 1890s, simply what men endured to earn their daily bread, simply the normal brutality of industrial production in an era before labor laws or safety regulations or the recognition that workers were human beings with rights rather than simply inputs in the production process, factors of production to be used as efficiently as possible, resources to be consumed like coal or lumber or stone, their bodies fuel for the great machine of construction that was transforming George's vision into limestone reality. The forests provided timber, thousands of board feet cut from George's newly acquired land, trees that had stood for centuries suddenly valuable because George owned them, because his ownership transformed them from landscape into resource, from nature into capital, from things that simply existed into things that could be harvested and sold and turned into floors and beams and joists for the house. The irony being that George was simultaneously pioneering sustainable forestry while cutting down forests to build his house, was demonstrating that forests could be preserved while also demonstrating that forests existed to serve human purposes, particularly wealthy human purposes, that nature was there to be managed and used and made profitable even if that profit-making was done sustainably, even if the harvesting was scientific and the replanting was systematic, because sustainability under capitalism doesn't mean leaving nature alone but rather using nature forever, doesn't mean preservation but rather perpetual extraction, doesn't mean forests for their own sake but rather forests as renewable resources, as sources of value that can be tapped indefinitely if managed properly, as capital that grows rather than diminishes if you're clever enough and patient enough and wealthy enough to wait for returns that might take decades, that might outlast your own lifetime, that might only benefit your children or grandchildren, the kind of long-term thinking that only generational wealth makes possible, that only those freed from immediate necessity can practice. The construction site itself became a small city, with temporary housing for workers who came from far away, with dining facilities and supply depots and workshops, with a railroad spur built specifically to deliver materials to the site, with its own brickmaking operation and woodworking facilities and stone-cutting yards, with a hierarchy as rigid as any factory, with supervisors and foremen and managers and specialists all arranged in a pyramid with George at the apex, rarely present but always in control, always the one whose approval was needed and whose vision determined everything and whose money made it all possible, whose absence was somehow more powerful than most people's presence because his will operated through intermediaries, through Hunt's designs and Olmsted's plans and Smith's management, through the systematic organization of labor and materials and expertise into a machine for realizing one man's dream, for manifesting in physical space what had existed only in imagination, for proving that with enough money anything was possible, that the only limit was vision rather than resources, that if you could imagine it and you were rich enough you could build it, and this lesson, this demonstration of wealth's power to reshape the world according to individual whim, was perhaps as important as the house itself, was perhaps the true statement that Biltmore made, that in America money could accomplish anything, could move mountains. Literally and figuratively, could build French chateaux in Carolina mountains, could create instant history and manufactured heritage, could purchase not just things but entire worlds, entire landscapes, entire communities worth of labor and expertise and attention, could command resources on a scale that resembled sovereign nations more than individual households, could operate with the power that had once been reserved for kings and emperors and was now available to anyone with sufficient millions, democracy having failed to democratize wealth even as it democratized political forms, having created a system where everyone was theoretically equal but where some people were so much more equal than others that the theory became ridiculous, became a joke that everyone understood but that no one quite acknowledged, became the polite fiction that allowed the Vanderbilts to build palaces while their workers lived in poverty and everyone pretended this was normal, this was natural, this was simply how things were and would always be. George traveled to Europe repeatedly during the construction years, buying furnishings and art and decorative objects with the same systematic thoroughness he brought to everything, spending months visiting dealers and auction houses and private collections, buying tapestries that had hung in European castles, buying paintings by old masters and modern artists, buying furniture that had been owned by French aristocrats and Italian nobles, buying entire rooms worth of coordinated objects. Buying beauty by the container load and shipping it across the Atlantic to fill his North Carolina chateau, and there's something both impressive and depressing about this, something that speaks to genuine taste and knowledge but also to the essentially derivative nature of American wealth in this period, the way that American millionaires were trying to buy their way into European cultural legitimacy, were trying to acquire through purchase what they couldn't create through native tradition. We're trying to import civilization along with tapestries and paintings, as if cultural authority could be bought, as if heritage could be purchased, as if owning things that Europeans had made could somehow make Americans European, could somehow erase the gap between old money and new, between inherited aristocracy and acquired wealth, between people who grew up surrounded by beauty and people who had to learn to recognize it, between those for whom taste was inheritance and those for whom it was aspiration, between being cultured and wanting to appear cultured, between actually belonging to the tradition you're evoking and simply appropriating its forms without understanding its substance. The library alone took years to assemble, 22,000 books purchased volume by volume, collection by collection, George working with dealers and attending auctions and personally selecting books that interested him, building a collection that was genuine even if its purpose was partly performative, that reflected real reading and real scholarship. Even if it also reflected the desire to be seen as scholarly, that served both intellectual curiosity and social ambition, that was both genuine achievement and calculated display, because with the very wealthy everything serves multiple purposes, every acquisition is both personal and political, every expression of taste is also a statement of status, every demonstration of knowledge is also a claim to authority, every beautiful object is both beautiful and a demonstration that you can afford. Beauty, both aesthetically valuable and socially strategic, both end and means, both pleasure and power. He bought first editions of major works in 8 languages, bought illuminated manuscripts from the Middle Ages, bought books that were themselves works of art with hand-tooled leather bindings and gilt edges and marbled end papers, bought the personal libraries of deceased collectors, entire collections absorbed into his own, knowledge accumulated through inheritance and purchase rather than through the slower organic growth that most libraries experience, instant expertise, immediate depth. The whole history of literature apparently mastered simply through having the resources to buy it, as if owning books were the same as reading them, as if possession were the same as understanding, though in fairness George did read, was genuinely literary, genuinely cultivated, genuinely interested in ideas and not just in appearing interested. But even genuine interest when backed by unlimited resources produces something different from ordinary reading, produces a relationship to books that most people can't imagine, where you can buy any book ever written without checking the price, where you can build a private library that rivals public institutions, where you can surround yourself so thoroughly with the physical manifestations of culture that you seem to inhabit a different world from those whose access to books is limited by library hours and borrowing periods and the pragmatic question of whether you can afford to buy what you want to read. The art collection followed similar patterns, George buying paintings by Renoir and Whistler and other contemporary artists, buying old master works when he could authenticate them and afford them, buying prints and drawings and sculptures, filling the chateau with so much art that almost every wall held something valuable, something beautiful, something that testified to his taste and his resources, creating an environment where culture was literally everywhere, where you couldn't escape beauty even if you wanted to, where every glance revealed something worth studying, where the house itself became a museum though a private one, accessible only to those George invited, only to those who moved in his social circles, only to other members of the wealthy elite who could appreciate what they were seeing because they had been educated to appreciate it, who could recognize the artists and periods and styles because they had been given the kind of education that only money could buy. That only access to private tutors and grand tours and elite universities could provide, the kind of cultural capital that was ostensibly about knowledge but was really about class, was really about being able to recognize other members of your class through shared cultural references, through the ability to discuss art and literature and music with the casual fluency that marked you as belonging, as one of us rather than one of them, as someone who deserved to be in spaces like Biltmore rather than someone who would merely gawk at its excess, who would see waste rather than beauty, who would calculate the cost rather than appreciate the aesthetics, who would think about the labor rather than admire the result, who would ask uncomfortable questions about how such wealth was accumulated and whether such concentration was just and what obligations came with such resources rather than simply accepting that some people had money and spent it and that was natural and normal and not worth questioning. The house finally opened on Christmas Eve 1895, George having spent approximately $6 million on construction and furnishing, a sum that represented more than most people would earn in multiple lifetimes, more than most communities would generate in years, more than most states would spend on public works, $6 million in 1890s money which was real money, gold-backed money, money that represented actual value rather than debt, money that could buy extraordinary amounts of labor and materials, money that translates to something like 300 million in today's terms, but that comparison doesn't really capture the difference because the ratio between George's wealth and ordinary people's wealth was far more extreme than such calculations suggest, because in the 1890s a working man might earn $500 per year while George had income of $250,000 annually, a ratio of 500 to 1, and today that ratio is closer to 100 to 1 for the very wealthy, meaning that George was relatively far richer than today's billionaires, was farther removed from normal economic reality than we can easily comprehend, occupied an economic stratosphere that has no current equivalent despite all our contemporary inequality, lived in a world where his annual income would have required 500 men working full-time for a year to produce, where his house cost the equivalent of 12,000 man years of labor, where every luxury he enjoyed represented someone else's lifetime of work, multiple someone else's, an army of workers whose years were consumed to produce his comfort, whose lives were spent building and maintaining his palace, whose existence was devoted to making his existence pleasant, whose purpose in the economic system was to serve his pleasure, and this relationship, this fundamental inequality where some people's labor produces other people's leisure, where some people's exhaustion produces other people's comfort, where some people's sacrifice produces other people's luxury, this is the relationship that Biltmore embodies, that every Gilded Age mansion embodies, that every great fortune represents if we're willing to look past the beauty to the brutality, past the achievement to the exploitation, past the vision to the violence, past the culture to the coercion that made it possible. The opening was celebrated with a Christmas party for George's family and close friends, the house finally complete enough to occupy, though work would continue for years, details would be added and adjusted and refined, but the main structure was done, the vision was realized, Hunt's architecture and Olmsted's landscapes and George's collection all combined into something that had never existed before, something that tried to be European in America, aristocratic in a democracy, permanent in a culture of change, old in a new world, that tried to capture in stone and mortar something that couldn't really be captured, some sense of belonging to tradition and history that money couldn't quite buy no matter how much you spent, because the chateau looked right, looked authentic, looked like it belonged in the Loire Valley, but it stood in North Carolina, stood in the wrong context, stood in a nation that had supposedly rejected everything the chateau represented, and this contradiction. This tension between the house and its setting, between what it tried to be and what it was, between its European aspirations and its American reality, this is part of what makes Biltmore fascinating and troubling, impressive and disturbing, beautiful and somehow wrong, a masterpiece that shouldn't exist, a palace that democracy should have prevented but that capitalism made possible, a building that testifies simultaneously to human achievement and human inequality, to what we can create and what we can't seem to prevent, to our capacity for beauty and our tolerance for injustice, to the way that great art and great exploitation can coexist, can emerge from the same system. Can be two sides of the same coin, can be products of the same economic forces that concentrate wealth and power in a few hands and leave those hands free to create whatever they want while other hands labor to realize those visions, to build those dreams, to make possible the beauty that they themselves will never fully enjoy, never fully access, never fully benefit from except as wages, except as the meager compensation that capitalism offers labor for producing the wealth that capital enjoys. George married Edith Stuyvesant Dresser in June 1898, he 35 and she 25, she from a good family but not a wealthy one, her father dead and her inheritance modest, marrying George meaning marrying into unimaginable wealth, moving from genteel poverty to absolute luxury, from budgeting and economy to unlimited resources, from constraint to freedom or at least to the kind of freedom that money provides, though perhaps also into a different kind of constraint, the social obligations and expectations that came with being a Vanderbilt, the need to perform wealth appropriately, to be a proper chatelaine of Biltmore, to manage servants and arrange entertainments and fulfill the social duties that the rich owed each other, to be decorative and cultured and appropriate, to embody the kind of refined femininity that American aristocracy demanded of its women, to be beautiful and tasteful and present but not too present, visible but not prominent, cultured but not intellectual, accomplished but not ambitious, to exist as ornament to George's life rather than as agent of her own, though in fairness Edith seems to have been intelligent and capable, seems to have had genuine interests and pursuits, seems to have managed the estate competently especially after George's death, but the structure of Gilded Age marriage, the economic and social realities that shaped it, meant that even capable women were constrained by expectations that had nothing to do with their abilities and everything to do with their gender, that limited them to domestic and social spheres however large and complex those spheres might be in a house like Biltmore, that prevented them from pursuing the kind of public achievement that men could pursue, that confined their influence to private realms and indirect methods, that made them partners perhaps but never equals, companions but never independent agents, presences but never authorities, their power always mediated through men, through husbands and sons, their legacy always attached to family rather than individual achievement, their names remembered if at all as appendages to more famous names, as wives and mothers rather than as themselves, and this too is part of what Biltmore represents, part of the social system it embodied, the way that gender and class intersected to create different kinds of constraint, different forms of limitation, the way that even wealthy women were constrained in ways that wealthy men were not, though of course the constraints of wealth were far preferable to the constraints of poverty, though being a rich woman was incomparably better than being a poor woman or any kind of man without resources, though we must hold multiple truths simultaneously, that Edith's life was constrained by gender expectations and that it was incomparably luxurious compared to almost everyone else alive.